So the series, the seminars that we're all involved in, the workshops, explore how books come to us and how we as readers come to books. And it's those pathways that we're particularly interested in. These are not theorized pathways necessarily, and they're also not necessarily critical pathways. They're pathways involving that immersion in a book, immersion in a poem, or in a story, or in a novel that we have as readers. And what this then raises is a question of being addressed, how we are addressed by books. Some people might say by texts, but that's a word that we're a little bit uncertain about in this project. How books and poems call to us and how they tell our stories or not, which is relevant to the fact of the writers, the British writers, Asian and Black British writers that we have invited to participate in the project. How books, current today, available to us, tell our stories or not, and if they don't tell our stories, how then do they appeal to us? Where do we identify? And this then relates to a further question, as I've already anticipated, of identity, how our identities are supported, echoed, confirmed, or in fact negated in the books that we turn to read. And there's a particular emphasis on that verb turn in that question. It's not simply a question of the books we read, but the books we actually turn towards to read, the books we feel called by, the books that relate to us in some way. And just to pick up two instances of writers who have addressed this question of calling and of identifying with a story, a book, a text, a poem, or not, feeling negated, here are two examples. This is Edouard Louie, who's a French writer, and he wrote this. He's reminiscing in a piece in The Guardian in February, he's reminiscing about a conversation with a taxi driver in which he announced that he was a writer, and the taxi driver's response to him, which resonated with his own experience, his own relationship and his family's relationship with literature, with books. Literature was not something we paid any attention to, quite the opposite. On television, we would see that the literary prizes went mostly to books that did not speak of us. And in any case, like the taxi driver, we were aware that, prize or no prize, books in general took no interest in our lives. My mother would say it over and over, us, the little folks, no one is interested in us. It was the feeling of being invisible in the eyes of other people that drove her to vote for Marine Le Pen, as did most of my family. My mother would say, she's the only one who talks about us. So you see how that quotation raises this question of the books that talk to us, that tell our stories, that have an interest in the little folks, and the books that don't. And Elleke has some fascinating stats in a moment to share with you about that. Here is the other example from a writer, participating writer in this project, Aminata Fauna, in which she talks about taking back stories and reversing the gaze. So she talks about owning stories. Where there aren't stories that call to us, what then do we do as writers? How do we adjust the balance? And she says, the power of the story lies in the hands of the storyteller. To see oneself only ever reflected through the eyes of another is to view the self through a distorting lens. This is the shared experience of all those whose place in history has been marginalized. And she goes on to quote someone called Cornelius Eady, who's the founder of Cave Canem, a writer's center with a focus on African American writing. And he said, with startling foresight, according to her, right now, as we speak, this is, by the way, Eady was speaking in November last year as Trump had been elected. Right now, as we speak, uptown, there are people in a building who are trying to write a narrative about who we are and who we are supposed to be and what to do about us. When you lose that story or you allow that narrative to be taken from you, bad things happen. It's our job and our duty to make sure we get to write our own story, the fullness of who we are in our own language. And what this project then would contribute to that observation is the making sure we also get to read our own stories, right? And how we identify, and this is as important, how we identify what those stories are, how we reach those stories out there, and how we feel drawn in by those stories. What is it about those stories that lets us in? So just a few words on the post-colonial, because that is a word that is mentioned in our blurb. Post-colonial writing is conventionally seen as relaying stories from the periphery, the third world, the global south. But we would want to add to those nominated spaces there that Britain too can be perceived as a post-colonial space. And that's one of the questions, the explorations of all of these books that we're reading in this project. And with the emphasis on reading and readers, how do we then, as readers located in Britain, receive these stories? How are we called by them? How do they call us? And how do we identify in relation to them? So we are fascinated to hear from those who have read these books, and we know that different groups have read different books. We are very curious about how you felt positioned by the book. Did you feel positioned as a British reader? Did you feel positioned as an ordinary reader? Did you feel positioned as a literary reader? Did you feel yourself to be British in the ways in which the book spoke to you, addressed you? Or did you feel that you were reminded of aspects of your heritage, for those of you who have backgrounds from elsewhere? So the accent throughout, and I'm sure we will repeat this throughout all the conversations we'll have, the accent is on these verbs, and it's very much on doing, reading as an activity, as an act. The accent on the verbs locate, identify, call. I've used all of them in what I've already said. The accent then is not so much on representation, on speaking on behalf of, or witnessing, which is still very much the focus or the perceived focus in post-colonial writing and reading. So we're not that interested in images that stand for something else, experiences of difference or strangeness. We're much more interested in involvement, in immersion through reading. So, interested in moving beyond code, and in my bit after the break I'll say a little bit more about that beyond code. How do we get there? But just to put it in a nutshell for now, and then I'll hand over to Elleke, we're interested in the novel or poem as an act of communication, not as standing for something else. So the experience of reading becomes primary. And for those of you who are at all familiar with Jacobson's 6 linguistic functions, any communication kind of groups itself or concentrates around, according to Jacobson, one of those functions, with poetic writing, literary writing, grouping here, according to Jacobson, the poetic function of language. What we're really keen to do in this project, and I certainly am very intrigued by, is whether we can see the literary text, the book, the novel, the story, the poem, as involving all of these functions at once in an unfolding and dynamic process, speaking to context, to information, speaking to the sender, the writer's particular stance, emotions, speaking to your responses as readers or receivers, speaking also to the nature of the language, the channel, right? The the metaphors or similes or what have you that you might be interested in, and then also, of course, to code. That is Jakobson in a very, very tiny nutshell, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. But what we're really keen to do is to stretch that diagram out, to see writing and our reading of this writing as an act of communication unfolding in time, a bit like music.